Microphone as well. Today we're reviewing the Paticca Samuppada Sutta, the primary sutta on dependent origination. The reason why I say primary is there's many suttas where the Buddha references this. Some are not quite as complete, but some are 9 or 10 steps. But in the context, you can see that those are also complete teachings. This is for anyone who wants to understand what the Buddha actually taught. An understanding of dependent origination of the Paticca Samuppada Sutta is primary. It can't be done without this understanding, because this sutta and the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Sutta on Four Noble Truths, defines the context, scope, and purpose of the entire Buddhist teaching. So if this sutta is not understood, or if it's adapted or accommodated or embellished in any way to fit views ignorant of Four Noble Truths, then everything that follows from that would be also corrupted or fabricated, which is exactly what this sutta teaches. You'll see that when I get to it. In order to create an alternative or false dharma that the Buddha talked about and referenced many times, this sutta has to be either adapted, accommodated, or embellished, or simply dismissed outright as irrelevant to whatever dharma you're trying to promote. And it's because of its simple directness and easily understood scope that it has to be adapted, accommodated, embellished, or dismissed in order for something else to take place. Many people, especially modern, I don't want to get too deep into this. Modern Buddhism looks at Theravadan Buddhism as the most closely form of Buddhism, closely resembles the Buddhist teachings. And I used to believe so. In fact, I used to call myself a Theravadan Buddhist many years ago, because that's what I believed. And I wanted to practice something that was directly taught by the Buddha, and not something that was embellished. As I came to understand this, the most of Theravada Buddhism is based on a presentation of dependent origination from a book called the Abhidhamma, which is not, this is a book that was added after the Buddha's passing, the book of the Pali Canon. And it's a very mystical, magical interpretation of this simple sutta, used to justify certain mystical and magical beliefs. And when I read the sutta, you'll see that there's nothing mystical or magical or otherworldly in the Buddhist teachings on this. It's also used, the simple word dependent origination sometimes is called dependent co-arising. That one word is used to justify false dharmas that claim that all things are interdependent, all things are interconnected, all things interbe. In fact, if you go on the internet and look it up, you'll see that there's the teachers, in fact, I'm thinking of one right now, he's got this great Blackboard presentation, and every single point that he's making has no relation at all to what the Buddha taught. But it serves very well to justify the Dharma that they're teaching. Now, I'm not putting down all these people, but the point that I'm trying to make, and I emphasize it often, is that by corrupting this Dhamma, you corrupt the entire Buddhist teaching. So this is so important to understand it and apply it correctly. So is that agreed by everyone?
Yeah.
You don't have to agree. That really is the case. And the more I understand the discrepancies in modern Buddhism, the more easily it is for me to trace it right back to a dismissal or an accommodation to this single sutta. The Buddha was at Savatthi, at Jita's Grove, Anatha Pandika's monastery. He addressed those assembled. Friends, I will describe in detail dependent origination. Listen carefully. And what is dependent origination? Dependent origination states that from ignorance of Four Noble Truths, that's not in the sutta itself, but it's implied, because that's everything the Buddha taught was taught to develop an understanding of Four Noble Truths, because prior to the Buddha's teaching, we're ignorant of that. The Buddha is not claiming that simply being human beings, we're just struck ignorant. It's a very specific ignorance. From ignorance, my words, of Four Noble Truths, back to the sutta, as a requisite condition comes fabrications. And as we've learned, and as we will learn further, it is a fabricated view of ourselves in relation to the world we live in that creates all confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing stress and suffering. That's a reference, what I just said, to 3 marks of existence: impermanence, the not self characteristic, and suffering. So it is from ignorance of Four Noble Truths as the requisite condition that allows for fabricated or corrupted or perverted views. So immediately the Buddha is pointing to the problem and the solution. The problem is ignorance of Four Noble Truths. The solution is knowledge of Four Noble Truths. And from when someone has useful knowledge of Four Noble Truths, they will not and cannot fabricate views, create corrupted views. And the Buddha's Dhamma is really just that simple. And included in that understanding of the Four Noble Truths is the 4th Noble Truth of the path leading to the cessation of ignorance or the cessation of fabricated views. It's the only path the Buddha ever taught. From those fabrications, rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, as a requisite condition, that has to take place first. We must be ignorant of Four Noble Truths, and we must start fabricating a view of ourselves in relation to the world. From that process, as a requisite condition, comes consciousness. So New Agers and many modern, and I'm not putting New Agers or modern Buddhists down, just to make the point, from as long as I can remember, New Age thought always taught consciousness as something that we're on the verge of a great and ever evolving one mind consciousness or one world consciousness, a consciousness that understands the interconnectedness and interdependence and interbeing of all things. And that has always been presented to me, since I can remember, as the ultimate evolution or ultimate goal of humanity. The Buddha taught to recognize exactly the opposite, that all things are discrete. And the problem of suffering arises not from a lack of interdependence or interconnectedness or interbeing. Confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing suffering arises from ignorance of Four Noble Truths that leads to the belief of interdependence, interconnectedness, and interbeing. Is that clear? And again, I got to qualify this because I'll get plenty of emails later today. I'm not saying that people should or shouldn't believe certain things. We're all free to believe whatever we want. That's one of the great freedoms of being a human being. No matter how much suffering we create in our lives, we are free to do anything we want and act in any way we want, except what most people don't realize is we are directly responsible in this lifetime for ignorance. And that's where our suffering and deluded thinking comes from. So this consciousness that we're talking about, look at it in the proper context of the sutta and where it comes. This is simply ongoing thinking rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths and seeing life from a fabricated view. Clear? That's our thinking. The Buddha recognized this. This is the profound understanding of an awakened human being. And he didn't rely on magical or mystical sources to relieve our ignorance, because he knew that was just furthering ignorance. It was that entire belief. Remember where the Buddha describes his ongoing process of awakening and how he came across these types of teachings and discarded them out of hand as simply being more distraction, leading to more suffering. So the problem is a mind rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, and that thinking is now interpreting the phenomena, the world it's living in, from that point of view of fabrications, an ignorant view. Excuse me. From that consciousness, as a requisite condition, comes name and form. Name and form, the Pali word is namarupa. It simply means that I've put a name to this form. Name to form. It's another way of saying self-identification, or the obsession with self-identification, because I've now identified this as myself. And when I do that from a mind rooted in fabrications, I'm subtly convincing myself that this is permanent, that there's something worth establishing as a permanent self, even though, as we learned through the Dhamma Vibhanga Sutta and many others, the self is simply made up of 4 common elements, the 5th property of space, and that 6th property of consciousness. And if that consciousness is rooted in ignorance, it's interpreting those other properties from a fabricated view. Is that clear? which another way of saying is I'm simply interpreting myself from a wrong view. I'm going to go back to that. From name and form as a requisite condition comes the sixth sense base. So now I've identified myself as this form, and now I'm going to use my senses, which is how a human being lives. We relate to the world through contact with our senses. But if my contact is rooted in, if my interpretation of the contact is rooted in a fabricated or corrupted or perverted view of what I'm coming in contact with, my interpretation is going to be fabricated. Right? Everybody follows that. Going right back to ignorance. And so the important thing is to remember that this whole process, rooted in ignorance, takes place, you can say that it takes place out of time. In other words, there's not a timeline that we can follow to say, okay, this fabrication has just occurred and 8 seconds later, consciousness occurred, then my relationship to name and form. It happens outside of time, or it happens so quickly that we don't recognize it, and we shouldn't be able to recognize it because we can get lost in the details of this. It's simply a teaching on how we go from ignorance to Four Noble Truths to all manner of suffering. And this is an important part because this is the Buddha here is describing the beginning of self-referential views, the beginning of conceit, the beginning of I-making. I'm going to read that once more. From name and form as a requisite condition, that has to take place first before I start using my senses with what I've self-identified with to start creating a fabricated view of, you're looking at the sequence. Yeah. I thought there might have been a bird up there or something.
I'm following you.
From the sixth sense base as a requisite condition comes contact. Makes sense, right? But again, the Buddha stated the obvious, which some people will just dismiss. Oh, why even bother with that? Of course. But look at the context of what the Buddha is saying here. It is because of a misunderstanding of self in relation to the world that now when I come in contact with the self, I am using that contact to validate my fabricated views. I'm using the contact with the world to validate my own ignorance. So when you hear me say we create these very powerful but subtle strategies to ignore our own ignorance, it is at this point of contact that I'm talking about. And we talk often that the Buddha's Dhamma is applied right here where the Buddha is talking about the beginning of I-making. It's at the point of contact with the world that we practice wise restraint. And how do we develop how do we know what wise restraint is? Because we integrate the Eightfold Path, and that gives us the right view to understand what's occurring in this moment and interrupt this process rooted in ignorance and ending in suffering. Clear? Mm-hmm. Again, that really, again, is a statement on the entire Dhamma. It's at the point of contact. And this describes it. Dependent Origination describes why I say that and why the Buddha says it. From contact as a requisite condition comes feeling. So notice this whole process, again, out of time. I've rooted myself in ignorance. I've created fabricated views that's feeding the way that I interpret the world. Now I come in contact with the world and I think this is me. I'm taking everything personal because it's happening to me. And out of that contact, I'm reacting. I am now the center of the universe. Everything that happens from that point on must be approved or disapproved by me, rather than awakening and simply accepting what's occurring because it's occurring. Again, that's the difference between what the Buddha teaches and much of what modern New Age thought and modern Buddhism is, which is a way of tricking ourselves into approving that all phenomena is wonderful and positive and good and leading us to someplace. When what the Buddha is teaching is all of that is rooted in ignorance and is leading you towards further ignorance. And this is where it solidifies in feeling. Now, this relates directly to what we're going to study next week and have been studying for a while, the 5 clinging aggregates, which are form, self-identification with form, nama rupa, and now feelings. And now feelings are lead to perceptions, additional mental fabrications, and that 5th part of the 5 clinging aggregates coming back to consciousness, ongoing thinking rooted in ignorance. Do you see how that 5 clinging aggregates ties directly now to dependent origination? Did you ever see it before? Or maybe not at the beginning of your Dhamma study?
No, definitely not at the beginning.
From feeling as a requisite condition comes craving. So now I've identified myself, and I've identified it through a feeling rooted interpreted through a fabricated view, but because that feeling feels good, I want more of it. Why? Because I self-identify with the feeling. Or that feeling was awful, an awful feeling. And so now I've created a fabrication or a condition against ever feeling something like that again. Which means we have now removed ourselves from our own life intentionally. Whether it was conscious or not doesn't really matter, because I've now done it. I'm saying there's aspects of life that I do not want to experience. But we don't have a choice in those things, do we? Most of them. Of course, there's many things we can not choose to do that lead to suffering. But most of what happens in life is completely impersonal. That's what the Buddha is teaching here. But because we have identified, we've placed a name to the form, and that form has experienced what's occurring, now I'm taking everything personal. Again, do you see the progression from ignorance and self-identification? Now using feelings interpreted by an ignorant view to justify and qualify what I'm experiencing. But it's all rooted in ignorance, isn't it? Yes, Anthony.
So when you really don't want something, is that another form of craving, or is that aversion?
It's the same. Well, craving and aversion are really two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Because aversion is craving for this not to happen. It's
right.
not,
That's what I was asking.
but it really is
another
that
form of craving.
Yes. And it could be something as simple as, oh, I just got a sniffle. Oh, God, I hope I don't get another cold. It's going to be the worst cold. Again, I'm being dramatic, but it's that type of thinking, that conditioned thinking that what I'm having is actually affecting me personal. When we all know that if you get a cold, take 2 aspirins, drink a lot of water, drink some vitamin C, and go to bed if you can. That's all that we do, because we understand it. Again, I'm using kind of a silly example, but we do that all the time, don't we? With things that we feel that in order for me to be happy, safe, and secure, something outside of me must be different than it is. And it's usually other people, but sometimes it's our social systems. Rather than understanding, and that doesn't mean that, it means we gain a profound understanding of the difference between acceptance and approval. And we talk about this in different ways here too. It doesn't mean that because I'm at peace with a societal system that causes suffering to a certain group of people, that by accepting it, I'm approving it. In fact, it means just the opposite. It means I'm seeing things clearly for the first time. I accept it because it's what's occurring, but I certainly don't approve it. And I don't approve it because of the framework of the Eightfold Path, not because of some type of conditioned thinking. And that allows me to engage in the world from a free of reaction and free of insisting that something be different than it is, or other people be different than they are. Excuse me. And then often inadvertently taking a religious view rather than a realistic view, meaning because I know that my view is right and anybody that doesn't follow me must be evil then. And that's just what's happening in the world today, isn't it? We're not taking sides based on even ideology. We're taking sides based on good and evil. And that's not just in this country, that's really taking place over the world. So we're creating a global system that is not based on, really on, I don't want to get too far into this, on totally democratic principles, but we're introducing religion. And so competing sides now seem to have their own prophets, the end is coming, or the end is going to be wonderful, their own prophets, their own saviors, and their own martyrs. And that's just an example of how corrupted our view has become. And it's because I am so morally and ethically above everyone else, it gives me the right to morally judge other people and other people's systems, rather than understanding that it's not moral or immoral at all. It's just ignorant. And again, that's what the Buddha teaches. It's the radical difference between what was established during the Buddhist time and during today too. Does everybody follow me? Did I get
but
that?
in order to accept it, I mean, I have trouble accepting it when the clerk follows me around the store thinking I'm going to steal something.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I accept that it's happening, but I don't accept the behavior as being okay. It's not okay.
It's not. But it's not up to you to approve it. And you just said you can accept it because you understand the reason why that person sees you as a possible threat is not because of who you are. I think, right? I mean, it is in some ways, isn't it? Because it's the color of your skin is why they're doing it.
That's what they're reacting to.
Yes. But that's based in their own ignorance, not based in any type of reality. You're not a bad person. You're not going to steal because you have black skin any more than I will because I'm white or anybody else. So it has nothing to do with you, except the situation does affect you, doesn't it? And it's another aspect of ignorance to say, well, you shouldn't let it affect you. That's not what I'm saying or what the Buddha's saying. He's simply saying to see these things clearly. And when I understand that that store clerk is ignorant rather than evil, there's a significant difference in my response, isn't it? So the underlying, this is really a good, you're making a very clear point. It's a useful situation. So rather than seeing that person as evil, which I could justify from my own ideology, I see them as simply corrupted in their thinking, which allows me to not take it personal. And maybe, if it's at all possible, probably not, to affect the situation of that person in a positive way. And it's difficult for many people to see that one fine point, but that is an important point.
Because it can't be personal because they don't know her.
How could they? And
if they knew her, they wouldn't be following her around.
Well, exactly. And we had I was with Ram. I had a little conversation with Ram about this. It is from understanding of the fabricated views in myself that I understand it in others, and I can let it go to the point that I won't have to react to it. And then I'm able maybe to introduce something helpful rather than saying all those people are evil. And there's certainly a justification for saying that. You can justify it, but it doesn't help. But when we can say that people that act in that way or in any other way that's aberrant towards other human beings, it's because of their ignorance. Now at least we're getting to the root of the problem. And when we say that, there's also a subtle aspect of claiming that other people are evil rather than simply rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, because we're able to introduce some people levels of religiosity that don't apply, such as the devil has taken over a whole class of people. And if the devil has taken over a whole class of people, we are really screwed, aren't we? Because now I can't do anything. I can't go up against the devil. The devil's right in line with God. I mean, do you see how this thinking can really get you lost rather than seeing something clearly?
I try to approach those things with empathy, because if I can get myself to feel sorry for that person because they carry around so much fear, because that's what prejudice is to me. It's just fear. It
is, and the Buddha teaches that from desire.
If I can feel sorry for that person, then I won't hate them.
Exactly, and that's an appropriate sorrow, not a condescending, oh, those poor souls. It's simply trying to think of a recent example. It came to mind, the Jussie Smollett thing. And again, I don't want to get into a political thing about it, who's right and who's wrong. But when they finally, I happened to be watching news that day, and they finally dropped the charges against this, I'm going to call him poor kid because I feel sorry for him, but also for everyone else, especially even when the police came on and started talking about it from their point of view. I felt so bad for them, even though they were basically saying this is another human being that we should crucify. And maybe they were entirely justified. I'm not saying that he was right in what he was doing, but think about what drove a young man on the verge of the most wonderful life we could imagine, meaning a movie star, most people would say that it drove him to do something. I mean, I kind of believe that he fabricated it. But that's awful that he thought that this was okay. And maybe I think these things too far, where did the model come from for him to think that this would be a reasonable thing to do?
Talk about deluded thinking.
Yeah, and how could you? And I can't blame him for that, can I? I can understand that it came up in his environment, and it led to a mind that was already, again, here's some speculation, rooted in ignorance, that was able to concoct this scheme. I mean, how could you not feel bad for this kid, this young man, and for everyone else that then got caught up in it because of their own ignorance? Wouldn't it be great if getting into speculation. Wouldn't it be great? I'm going to say it anyway. If the cops got up, I was thinking this at the time, if they just said, look, we really think that this guy did it, but, okay, we all know that. Let's let this guy have a life. Because ultimately, it didn't really hurt anybody, did it?
No.
Except maybe you can make the argument that people that say that in the future that were actually victims, but that's not going to happen. You know, people aren't going to dismiss hatred because of Jussie Smollett. They won't. So it's the whole thing. And again, I'm just using it as a complete overreaction to everything. It's just if people had understanding of what occurred, they would have true empathy for everyone involved and not have to pick one side is evil and one side is good.
Yeah.
From that type of craving, as a requisite condition, comes clinging and maintaining. So once I decide I'm craving for, I'm desiring something, or I'm averse to something, now because of my fabricated views, I'm going to cling to those views or those experiences or those people, and I'm also going to maintain it rooted in this ongoing sequence of ignorance. Clear? So you can say that there's two aspects to clinging and maintaining. There's clinging and maintaining. Or you could say clinging is maintaining, holding on to things, holding on to views, even though we know that they might be hurtful towards ourselves and others. We justify it through our fabrications. And usually we do boil it down to good versus evil in our own minds. That's a lot of the internal struggle. And that's just because we've been conditioned towards a religiosity, a religious view of a way of looking at the world that is religious in that sense, that it's good versus evil, not just two different views. And I'll get too deep into that. Or many different views is really what I was going to say. From clinging and maintaining as a requisite condition comes becoming. That's the whole point. What are we going to become in this moment? Because that's what dependent origination is teaching us. It is in this moment, at the point of contact, where I'm interpreting phenomena, whether from a fabricated, corrupted view or a view that is rooted in the reality of understanding Four Noble Truths. And if it's the latter, then in this moment, I can continue to become awakened. If my views in this moment continue to be rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, I can't help looking over there. If my views continue to be rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, the only choice that I have is no choice. I can only become further ignorant, which makes sense, doesn't it? If my views are rooted in ignorance, the experiences that I have are going to continually reconfirm that view, because my views themselves are doing that, continuing to ignore ignorance, and so I can only become further ignorant. Again, that's the profound understanding that the Buddha awakened to. And then he considered carefully, how can I get past this profound understanding that it is ignorance of Four Noble Truths that leads to all manner of suffering and becoming further ignorant? What can I do? And he decided or understood that it would take an eightfold path to recognize and abandon those fabricated views. Not just meditation, but a well-concentrated mind framed by the other 7 factors that allows us to recognize and abandon fabrications, recognize and abandon further becoming.
So when your mind is going off on a fabrication, it's not in the present.
Never. And it's outside of its...
Is it always in the past or the future? Or?
Yes, it's in a fabricated state. It's in a non-physical state,
yeah.
Right? Because it's really just your imagination. Even if you can put yourself into... I had a car accident. Yeah, I didn't have a car accident, but I had a car accident yesterday. That's something visceral that we can put ourselves in. It's still not occurring now, is it?
No.
So it's a non-physical existence that I'm, and so now I can get into the car accident and the terrible person that missed the blah, blah. None of it is based in reality, is it? It's all a fabrication, even if it actually occurred. And the same thing that we might be worried about something that's going to happen tomorrow or next week. And it's a situation that has happened in the past that was painful to us. And we know that the parameters of the situation are going to come up again. And so we react to it from a conditioned mind. Oh, that's going to be an awful experience. And we'll spend the next week or 10 weeks or 10 days or 10 years coming up to that, being distracted by it, when it's in my mind, isn't it? It's not what's occurring. So
to get around all that you're teaching today, if you could profoundly choose to be in the present, everything you've said today will be dismissed.
Yes, and that if you could profoundly choose, the Buddha
Yeah.
recognized that we can't just choose. It's like
Well,
that
understand, I mean, you know.
yeah, but you bring up an important point because much of modern Buddhism and modern New Age thought is taught that you just have to be present. It's taught that there's the power of now. Well, the problem is that most people, when they start listening to that and don't have the proper context, fool themselves into thinking that now is the past or the future because their minds are stuck there. The Buddha never taught that our mind should be in the now because he knew that that was an impossible thing to do. We can't perceive the now, but we can have our minds not distracted from the past into the future, and which means that we are present for our life as our life unfolds. It's maybe a little bit of semantics, but the focus isn't, I got to be present, I got to be now, I got to be in the now, I got to be that's just another distraction. But by using meditation and deepen concentration, I've now brought my mind back into my body so I can simply be present and undistracted with my life as my life unfolds. Do you see the difference between that and being focused on the now? And then I am in the process of becoming, and I'm in control of the process. Because if my mind is united in my body, and I've recognized fabrications, I might not even have abandoned them all, but at least now I understand that it is at the point of contact, according to this sutta and many others, that I practice restraint. I practice that understanding that I'm developing. And as you and all of us have talked about, it is at different applications in different circumstances that we are applying the Dhamma now. And every one of you can say that, right? That you've recognized applications of the Dhamma in the moment, you applied it. That means that you're practicing wise restraint. That's what that is. Has everybody done that? I think they all have. Yeah, that's the Dhamma. And that's how we turn the moment from becoming further ignorant to becoming awakened, just that way. From clinging and maintaining as a requisite condition comes becoming. From that becoming, from clinging and maintaining as a requisite condition comes becoming. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth. Now, this is where most teachings fall off the rails because they take this one line and say, oh, the Buddha's teaching a creation myth and how the whole world came into being. And some of the dependent origination, dependent co-arising, interdependence confusion comes from the Abhidhamma translation of this. And they claim that in the sutta, and if you read the sutta, it has nothing to do with this, but they claim that the Buddha teaches that it takes three human lives to create a human life. I can never make any sense of that because what was going on in those other two lives. But it also tries to use dependent origination as teaching how human beings come into form. We've just read it. Is there anything that talks anything about how babies are born or anything like that? It just doesn't say it. And so the Buddhist, in context, what the Buddha is saying as a requisite condition comes birth, look at the context. From clinging and maintaining as a requisite condition comes becoming, from becoming comes birth. In the context of this sutta, it's just what I said. We're giving birth to another moment rooted in ignorance. But if we interrupt this process, then we have the opportunity to give birth to another moment that is rooted in wisdom, and so to become awakened. That's the entire, that's 99% of the Buddha's concern with birth. He was not concerned about future births, except in a way of saying, if you want to have any freedom in your life, you'll awaken now so as to not promote another birth rooted in ignorance. Excuse me.
And basically, he's just talking about another future moment.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And the Buddha is really not concerned to an awakened human being. A future birth is simply another moment rooted in time, and it's part of the continuation. And if you look at, I'm unaware of what occurs from one moment to the next. I mean, in a general way, I am. But as far as the process of moving me from one moment to the next, I am completely unaware and out of control of it. But you could say that each moment, and it's somewhat true, each moment the human body creates millions of cells and it sloughs off millions of cells. That's part of the process. That's the process of elimination. So you can accurately say from one moment to the next, this body is completely different. The same is true if you want to believe in reincarnation. which we don't. But even if you do, it's the same process, isn't it? It's just longer between breaths. But the process is still the same if you believe in reincarnation. It's just from one moment to the next. The Buddha didn't teach that either, that there's not a continuation of a self. That would imply permanence. It isn't that either. But the point of the Buddha's teachings is to awaken in this lifetime so as not to promote the need for continuation. From birth, and it relates directly to this, from birth as a requisite condition comes aging, sickness, death, sorrow, regret, pain, distress, and despair. So the Buddha's, again, this is where people get confused because they don't take it in context. The Buddha's teaching that from ignorance as a requisite condition, we give birth continually, birth, rebirth, 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 to moments rooted in ignorance. And it's because of that we experience, because of fabricated views, reaction to simple aging, sickness, death, sorrow, regret, pain, distress, and despair. It's all part of life. As a consequence of having a human life, we are going to experience these things. But if our minds are rooted in ignorance, we will react to them and create self-referential views about them and lose the ability to discern between approval and acceptance. Now, what is aging and death? Aging is decrepitude, brokenness, graying, decline, weakening of the faculties. Death is the passing away of the five clinging aggregates and the ending of time, the interruption of the life process. There's a caution and a warning here. The Buddha's teaching, just like he taught Bahia and all of us, that we never know when the end is coming. It's an interruption of this process. If we don't want to be interrupted in our awakening, we better take to the Dhamma and awaken. Or else, it is out of our control, isn't it?
It's interesting how the Buddha chose the most negative words to describe aging. He could have said it's experience, it's humility. There's a lot of good things about aging too.
Yeah, but he taught in a way that's called via negativa.
He wanted to make it starkly obvious.
He wanted to point out what we don't want to really face. Everybody knows there's sickness, aging, and death in life, but we romanticize it. We create novel ways of looking at it that aren't based in reality. We think, and because of that, we can fool ourselves into thinking, I have a right to decide what makes me happy and what doesn't make me happy. And if those things occur in my life that are completely arbitrary and personal, that I have decided that I don't like, I'm going to be upset. The Buddha is saying they're going to happen. And it's because of fabricated views that you create confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing distress because of that. These are going to occur. He's not saying enjoy it. He's not saying to think positively about it, but he's avoiding that type of religious thinking, meaning always positive thinking, to see things in reality. And that is the most powerful teaching the Buddha can give. And most religion is geared towards that, even though there's so much suffering in the world, but somebody suffered for your sin, so you don't got to worry about it. That's not an issue. Well, the Buddha really stood that on its head, didn't he? Say, yeah, this is the issue. This is a primary issue, and it's because we're preoccupied with it. In other words, to continue a strategy that allows me to ignore most of my life. Do you see what I'm talking about? We create strategies to ignore
aging.
Yeah. Well,
try to ignore it.
And try to ignore it, that death, the cow is right around the next corner. Well, if I'm really concerned about awakening, which as Dhamma practitioners, I hope we all are, we'll understand what the Buddha's teaching here. He's not teaching something to denigrate us as human beings. He's saying, you better hurry up. You better take to it. Because none of us know when the end is coming. And along the way, if we don't, we're going to be disappointed and confused. Here's a way, the Dhamma, to not have that life experience. Remarkable, isn't it? And it has to be pointed out. The difficulties in not doing this are just as important to point out as glossing over it and just saying, well, all you got to do is memorize or meditate and understand your true inner Buddha nature and you're good to go. That's not what the Buddha taught. And that's just ignoring ignorance, isn't it? So this thing that is prone to all those things we looked at last week and the inner parts of the body and the phlegm and all that, the Buddha teaches those things, the obvious thing, to say, don't be so enamored with this. Don't be so so attached to this thing that is always changing and is prone to these things. Sure, it's wonderful, but that's not the Buddha's Dhamma. So he's teaching a way to abandon all the things that cause distress in my mind so that I can live in this wonderful thing called human life. But it's wonderful because I understand it, not because it's not ever painful. It is. And it's through that understanding of the inherent suffering in life that is rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths that I am able to actually develop a calm and peaceful mind, not by ignoring it or distracting it. Thank you for that. It's such an important point. Now, what is birth? Birth is the descent, the coming forth, the coming to be, meaning coming to be ignorant or wise. Birth is the appearance of the sixth sense base and the five clinging aggregates, meaning the birth of ignorance now gives rise to a misinterpretation rooted in fabrications. Now, what is becoming? Becoming is sensual. Becoming is sensual becoming, form becoming, and formless becoming. That formless becoming means many things, but most importantly, it means establishing ourselves in non-physical realms. The past, the future, an ideological view of who I might be in the future, this deciding that I have an inner Buddha nature is all part of that. It's all part of formless becoming. Excuse me. And that's a very convenient place to establish myself, isn't it? A non-physical, a formless becoming. Because who can argue with it? Once I decide that that's the case, once I decided that, I'll use this just as an example. Once I decide that Jesus died for my sins, I'm pretty good to go. I don't have to worry about getting up on that thing myself. I've created a fabricated view, haven't I? Or any of the other ways that I can extricate myself from my own ignorance rather than facing it. I can chant myself or bow myself or visualize myself or simply just meditate ever and ever, forever and ever and ever without a real framework to do that. It's just a fabrication, isn't it? And the Buddha said, don't do it if you want to awaken. Here's an eightfold path to understand what's occurring, rather than develop another religion to avoid what's occurring. Jen, you want me to wait?
No, it's okay.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I can just keep talking. And what is clinging and maintaining? There are four types of clinging. Clinging to sensory stimulus, clinging to views, meaning conditioned thinking, clinging to precepts and practices, and clinging to a doctrine of self. All those things we continue to do this day, don't we, in modern Buddhism, and simply much of our ritualized life. We do things that we, in a ritualistic manner that helps us maintain our own ignorance. And what is craving? There are 6 classes of craving. Craving for sounds, craving for smells, craving for taste, craving for physical sensations, and craving for ideas, related directly to the sixth sense base. And what is feeling? Feeling has 6 classes as well. Feeling from eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, taste contact, body contact, and intellect contact. Again, related directly to the sixth sense base. At that point of contact, again, is where we practice the Dhamma. And the Buddha teaches this right here directly. And what is contact? Phenomena contacting the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the intellect. Again, at the point of contact. This is contact with the sixth sense base. So if you look at the sixth sense base as our way of interpreting our experience in the world, do you see that it is at that point of contact that we would eye make? That is the obvious point of eye making? And if the problem is false views of self leading to continual eye making, it would be at that point of eye making that we can disassemble or interrupt the process of eye making. And another way of describing eye making is ongoing ignorance of fabricated views. So the only way that I can do it is at the point of fabrication, isn't it? As I find myself fabricating, I don't remember what it was, Mary, that you brought up, but a situation that you were able to describe the point of contact and you recognized the fabrication in it. And so we're able to abandon it. Yeah. That's how the Dhamma, and you've described, we all have described this in similar ways. that's where the Dhamma works. That's where it's applied. That's where it's most powerful.
John, can I just say that I think also understanding name and form doesn't exist, really. It's our fabrication that.
Oh, well, we can understand the concept of self-identification.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't,
It really, if you're an awakened person, name and form doesn't exist. I mean, you just recognize these 6 properties.
it doesn't exist for you because you're no longer affected by it. And even to take your thought even further, it doesn't exist at all except in fabrications.
Yeah.
And as the Buddha teaches, fabrications are like foam on the ocean. Poof. There's nothing really to them, except we give them so much power, don't we? Why? Because I self-identified with it. And it can be anything, it can be anything that we self-identify with.
Well, when you talk about form not existing, you mean it's impermanent. It's impermanent.
It's ever changing, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing permanent about it. And again, the underlying teaching is very practical, where the Buddha teaches to look at what happens to a body. Even prior to death, it's full of these fluids that are rather unpleasant. And upon death, look what happens to it. And only to teach, why would we be so enamored with it? Just to see it in reality, kind of like what Anthony brought up. Why should we be concerned with how unpleasant the body is at times? Because we've so created a fabricated view of ourselves that doesn't see that reality. And so we don't have a balanced view of what's really occurring in our life.
I wonder why the Buddha put name and form together.
Well, because that was the interpretation from the original Prakrit, which was the Buddha's language, was taken into Pali.
Right.
And Pali, the word for self-identification in Pali is namarupa.
Right.
So most of the translations translate that as name and form.
Okay, got you.
And even in the misapplications take namarupa and misapply that and create a whole new doctrine about what that means. But that's what it means. Rupa means form, nama means name, self-identification with form.
When you said before, you said name to form, which was the first time I ever heard you say that. I don't know if it was an accident, but it kind of
Yeah, applying a name to the form.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, which kind of was like, oh, right, now that makes sense.
Yeah, and that is
You're naming.
it's an intentional decision to do that. I was going to say it's conscious, but for most of us, it's not conscious. It's simply conditioned. We're conditioned to think this way. And once we self-identify with this and insist that this is me, always, we start creating stress and suffering because that's a fabricated view. A unfabricated view is exactly as the Buddha described in the Dhamma Vibhanga Sutta. I am made up of those earth, wind, fire, water, space, and consciousness. Every human being has those 6 properties. That's it. And so we are all the same except by what conditions those properties. Remember, this is a 6th property called consciousness. And that's the interpretive body for what's occurring through the other elements. But no matter how I want to interpret myself, I can't change the fact that I'm 6 properties. That's me. That's all I can ever be as a human being. I can acquire things. I can learn things. I can take positions on things. I can be heroic or what's the opposite of heroic? Hurtful, I guess. I can create any kind of cowardly.
Super villain.
I can do anything. I mean, really. And human life is built in such a way that it allows for the development of every type of behavior. Why? Because of freedom. I mean, really, we are free to do anything we want. But if our minds are rooted in ignorance, some of us are going to create some pretty awful villains. And some of us will create saviors and prophets and martyrs and senators and bicycle. It's unlimited what we can become. And none of it matters, does it really? Unless I'm awakened to understand the process. So all of those things, all the things that we can become, the one thing that we should want to become overall, we don't. Why? Because we feel like we're going to lose ourselves if we do so. we create very powerful strategies to ignore our own ignorance, including an ever constantly changing religious view of the world. And again, I'm using that in a broad sense. You know, a religion has prophets, saviors, and martyrs. So if our thinking has any of those qualities, we have a religious view of that we're living in the world, in which the Buddha would say, and I would say, is an unrealistic way of looking at the world. And it doesn't say that there's no such thing as creator, gods, and divas, or anything like that. But it's not useful to hang your hat on that, to believe in that, to believe in an outside intervention is going to change the way I think. And to me, just history is enough proof for that. That's not going to occur. Thank you. Phenomena contacting the tongue, contacting the body, contacting the intellect. This is contact with the sixth sense base. And what is name and form? Name and form is feeling, perception, intention, attention, and contact. So all those things. And so look at each one of those. We use perception, intention, attention, and contact to continually reinforce name and form, self-identification, don't we? So it is through those qualities, you could even say through those schemes, that we find awakening also. Through changing perceptions, changing our intention from wrong intention to right intention, changing what we attend to, what we hold in mind. That's refined mindfulness, isn't it? Attention. And then ultimately what we come in contact with. And we talked about this, that, excuse me, the seclusion that we can establish in meditation, the concentration, we then take off our cushion and practice that seclusion while we're in the midst of the world. We are able to maintain a well-concentrated and secluded mind no matter what's occurring in the world. So we are able to practice restraint at the point of contact. Clear?
It's harder and harder and harder.
It's well, I would say it will get easier and easier and easier the more we practice it. It literally is like an exercise practice. You want to strengthen your biceps, you do curls. You want to strengthen your Dhamma, do this. Be willing.
In this present time, there's just so much coming at you that's just unacceptable.
Thank you. That brings up another point. It's okay to stop it coming at you all the time. In fact, I would say it's the essence of mental health today, not just Dhamma practice, to practice restraint at all of the social media, all at the news media, all of that. Stop it. You know, it really is. It seems more and more today. I always try to avoid saying that things are worse today than they ever were, because in general they aren't. The same issues that are around today were around during the Buddhist time. We just didn't have such an immediate understanding of it. We didn't have a worldwide news media. But the model of what the Buddha, how they lived their lives, is important, and we can incorporate it. Create that seclusion in your mind and in your home. You don't have to always be exposed to what's occurring. And again, I would say it's a mental health issue. You just can't be. And we're simply not meant to be, you know, to live our lives that way, even though, you know, the human race survived millions of years without news of any kind except what your neighbor was pouring into your ear. And then even in my lifetime, when I grew up, you got your news between 5 and 7. If you wanted commentary, you listened till 7. But most of the time, you got all the news you needed between 5 and 6, and 11 to, or 10 and 11, whatever it was. I don't remember what time news was on back then. But that was it. And somehow the world survived with 1 or 2 hours of news a day. Now look at it. We have 24/7 news coming at us, or so-called news coming at us from every single direction. And what are we doing? We're losing our minds, aren't we? I mean, look at it. I think that the overall angry rhetoric might subside a little bit if we went back to at the most 2 hours a day. You know? But so there's the answer. I mean, I think we are working ourselves up into a frenzy at times too. That's not very helpful. I think we are seeing the world more and more in an unrealistic way. And not to say that there's not awful things going on and awful positions people are taking on both sides, I have to say. But the underlying issue is still the same. It's always been the same. It's ignorance. You know? I don't want to go too far with this. In my life, I came through a long period, even though I was very, very young. I was just beginning school. That every moment, Mary, you're much younger than me, but you might remember this. That every moment there was a possibility we were going to end up in a nuclear war. And we had quite a few years of that. It wasn't just, a tough week with the Russians and the Cubans. It lasted up until and past that Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I grew up in a time where every moment I'm listening to that air raid siren because I better go take cover. And I was walking home one day, and it was just a drill. They did a lot of drills back then. And the air raid siren went off. And I went screaming into the closest house, banging on their door to let me in your basement because we're all going to die. And everybody my age grew up with that. So to say that things are much worse now than they ever were, I don't know. They've been difficult for a long time. But the same was true during the Buddhist time. We weren't on the verge of nuclear annihilation, but there were constant battles between one little kingdom and the next, always. We are just violent people because our minds are rooted in ignorance. Maybe we can change it. And it is a struggle, though, isn't it, Mary? And we talk about this often. There's so much going on in the world. How can I just meditate?
Well, you do when you just look at it. I look at it and say, there's nothing I'm immediately going to do to change that. So
yeah,
just know that it's there and try to do the right thing.
Yeah, and from my own personal experience, I went from quite an ideological view of the world. I would say I was born into a left-leaning family. Let's put it at that. And so that's how I looked at things. And then as I spent years in business, I kind of went to the conservative side because that made sense for what I was doing. And I found out that both extreme views are hurtful to people, but both views have a middle way, much like the Buddha teaches, that is very useful for people. And if we can get away from the ideological rhetoric, then we could come back to the middle. That really had nothing to do with what you were saying, did it, Mary?
No, but but that is absolutely true.
Yeah, and the difficult politics today are also something that is fabricated too. And to fight against a fabricated view is really foolish. The most wise thing to do is to take to the Dhamma and awaken. And so at least to be an example to others that would be different and keep the hurtful rhetoric going. Continuing on what is name and form, discriminating self-referential consciousness, not something good to have, is name. Discriminating self-referential consciousness is name. The elements of water, fire, earth, and wind, that which makes up physical forms, is called form. Name and form is discriminating consciousness bound to or clinging to physical form. Self-identification. And what is consciousness? There are 6 classes of consciousness, all relate to the point of contact. There's eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and intellect consciousness. That's obvious to everyone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow, that was really good pie. That's tongue consciousness, interpreted through my consciousness. But if my mind was conditioned again to hate apples or cinnamon, that was awful. But that's my interpretation of what was occurring, wasn't it? It wasn't awful or not. It was just what it was. It was just a taste. Because I'm conditioned to not like cinnamon or apple or whatever it might be. It was awful to me, but it may not be awful to you. But for me to create a religion against everyone eating apple pie is evil because I hate apple pie. But isn't that what is occurring? I'm using a silly example to make a point. Because my view is the right view. You're evil to not have that view. Instead of, well, look at that person. He's only has that view of hating apple pie because he's ignorant of apple pie. And what are fabrications? There are 3 fabrications. There's bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, and mental fabrications. Those are the only 3 that we have to deal with. Bodily, verbal, and mental. And what is ignorance? If we're ever concerned about what the Buddha is referring to as ignorance, he describes it here. And what is ignorance? Ignorance is not knowing stress. The first noble truth is stress occurs. Not knowing the origination of stress. The second noble truth. Craving originates and clinging perpetuates stress. Not knowing that. Not knowing the cessation of stress is ignorance, meaning the third noble truth. Cessation of stress is possible. Not knowing that is ignorance. The Buddha, when he describes the experience of developing understanding of the third noble truth, he describes it as an experiential understanding, having abandoned ignorance. And ignorance is not knowing the eightfold path leading to the cessation of stress. So if we want to end our ignorance, what do? We develop the eightfold path. And it's that simple. When I read the Buddha's Dhamma, and it was a couple years into actually reading the Buddha's words, it just struck me so strongly as how could we have gotten so confused when the Buddha is so simple and direct, and he never falls out of the context of dependent origination, ever. There's not one teaching you can say doesn't relate to this. How do we get it so wrong? Let me go back to that one, because this is really what is most important. And what is ignorance? Ignorance is not knowing stress, not knowing the origination of stress, not knowing the cessation of stress, not knowing the eightfold path leading to the cessation of stress. That's the Four Noble Truths, isn't it? Ignorance of Four Noble Truths. The Buddha concludes the sutta by saying this is called ignorance. No, I'm sorry. So now he takes us back through the undoing of this. Now, from the remainderless fading and cessation of ignorance comes the cessation of fabrications. How do we end our ignorance? The Buddha just told us through the Eightfold Path, through developing understanding of the Four Noble Truths. From the cessation of that ignorance, from the cessation of fabrications, comes the cessation of consciousness. Of course, the Buddha is not saying that when we awaken, we stop thinking. That would just be foolish to think that way. But remember the context. Comes the cessation of ongoing thinking rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. That's the whole point. From the cessation of that type of thinking comes the cessation of name and form, of self-identification with phenomena. You can make your mama go there. From the cessation of self-identification or name and form comes the cessation of the sixth sense base. It doesn't mean that upon awakening we are now cut off from our senses. It simply means we stop using our senses to give birth to another moment rooted in ignorance. Clear? Mm-hmm. That's the whole point of this. From the cessation of the sixth sense base, meaning using our bases, our senses to continue to fabricate views, from the cessation of the sixth sense base comes the cessation of contact. Again, of course, it doesn't mean that we lose the ability to feel. It simply means we're not using that ability of contact with phenomena to reinforce ignorance. From the cessation of contact comes the cessation of feeling. From the cessation of feeling comes the cessation of craving. From the cessation of craving comes the cessation of clinging and maintaining. From the cessation of clinging and maintaining comes the cessation of becoming further ignorant. From the cessation of becoming further ignorant comes the cessation of giving birth to ignorance. From the cessation of giving birth to ignorance comes the cessation of reacting to, and I'm putting my own words here in this, reacting to sickness, aging, death, sorrow, pain, distress, despair, and confusion. Wisdom brings the cessation to the entire mass of stress and suffering. Wisdom of Four Noble Truths. Thank you. It's the end of the sutta. Remarkable sutta, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I think you've heard it in a way that is even more meaningful than before. Yeah. Because that's how dependent origination is. It's just that way. We make connections to it that we didn't even see the first time. I bet you the first 10 times you heard it, it probably seemed a little bit like nonsense, or at least out of your reach. But eventually you see it as the keystone of the Buddhist Dhamma, isn't it? And so you can also see when you change this, even if you change one line in it, you lose the whole context, don't you? Or cut something out. You just miss it. But when you understand it, you also understand that at any one of these links in this chain, any one of the links in this chain can be broken, and so the process is interrupted at that point. If you understand self-identification, you cut the link there. If you understand and eliminate craving, you're cutting that process of dependent origination. Most importantly, if you recognize fabrications are rooted in ignorance and cut that link, you're awakened. So let's go around the room. Jen, good to see you.
I unfortunately have to leave early today, but it was, very detailed, a lot of stuff in there, and a little bit tough for me to listen to because I'm the bottom, like the bottom line, and this you really have to walk your way through it.
Yeah.
In order to hear what the Buddha is trying to teach, which is how can we see this process?
Yes.
Because it is instantaneous.
Yep.
It goes from ignorance to dukkha, like not even,
Yep.
not even, it's so fast.
Yep.
And it's exponential. So it's not just one process of ignorance. It's like, it's happening over and over and over again.
Continually.
It's continuing. It's happening. One consciousness can lead to lots of I don't even have them all memorized, but every single phenomenon that occurs can lead to contact and feeling and craving.
Yep.
And all of that then just becomes amplified. And so in order to just catch it somewhere so that you can cut bait, you have to trudge through it all.
And what is the point in the sutta that continues ignorance? What is the one thing?
Ignorance.
What in further along in the process, what does it require to continue it in this moment? I'll answer the question.
Yeah.
It's clinging and maintaining, and that's what we do.
Yeah.
That's what we do with a fabricated view. We cling to those views, and we create very powerful strategies to maintain those views. And that leads to a distracted quality of mind because it's always preoccupied with doing that, engaging in that ongoing process. And that's why meditation is taught to deepen concentration and nothing else, so that we can actually do that. It's a completely practical teaching. It's not.
If you're distracted.
You can't do it if you're distracted, especially if you're engaging in a so-called spiritual religious practice that is designed to continue to distract you, whether it's to a future reward or any other way. You're lost. You can't. Not to say that you shouldn't do that, but if you want to practice the Buddha's Dhamma, this is how you do it. And it is just that way too. It is through this understanding, this sutta. But it's much more useful to you now than it's ever been.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It's important. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Lorna, good to see you. Have a great day. Say hello to Alex.
You too. And he says hi too.
I really don't have much to say, but impermanence is, you should be grateful for impermanence, because it's impermanence that gives you the opportunity to change how you think.
Yeah.
So impermanence is foundation of changing.
Yeah. If there wasn't impermanence, nothing would.
Stuck.
Yeah, we're stuck. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you can look at impermanence in a favorable way, at least to understand that. Yeah, it affords me the possibility, and it also affords me the process. And Alvin Toffler wrote in this book from years ago. I don't know if anybody remember, called Future Shock. And the one thing I remember is he said that time is a currency of exchange that makes all things possible. And Jen said at the retreat, I think it was the last one, that ignorance requires time. And that's so profound, because time plays out in ignorance. Once we're awakened, time doesn't really have any other meaning except as a reference point. I got to be at the doctor's at 10 o'clock. but nothing else. We're not preoccupied with time rolling on or anything like that. It's just part of life. Thank you. Anthony, good to see you.
Good morning. I have nothing to say, so I'll just sit here in noble silence.
I'm glad you're here. Mary, good to see you this morning. How are you?
I mean, it's beautiful the way he ties everything together. And you think when we hear you read it, you think he's going to say something different, but no, everything has already been said, and everything is tied in back to the Four Noble Truths, back to the Eightfold Path, and it's just so beautiful the way he put together this sutta, and it really makes you realize, oh, this really is all there is to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. It is regretful to me. I'm lamenting the fact that this is the one sutta that is either dismissed or completely corrupted to allow for much of what's presented as modern Buddhism. When you read the sutta, it gets right to the point. So you really can't, unless you change it, it's not very useful to you if you want to continue corrupted views. But that's just it. It's remarkable. Every now and then, I just did it again the other day just to see what else is cropped up, to do a YouTube search or just a website search on dependent origination videos, and it's quite entertaining. Our retreat is less than a month. If you're coming and you haven't signed up, please do so soon. Why did I do that? We'll finish with metta as we always do. So these are the Buddha's words on metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able, excuse me, let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, free from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for a wonderful class this morning. Peace.
Thank you, John.